Lecture 25 is called The U.S. in World History. A theme here, how to include the United States in world history, when it's usually left out. And indeed, one of the reasons that world history was created was to focus on non-Western, non-U.S. Stories. So let's talk about this a bit. In my mind, it's absurd to try to ignore the U.S. in world history. The U.S. is the greatest economic power in the world and has been for some time. The financial capital of the world moved to New York from London during the First World War. That was a century ago. In military power, the United States not only arms much of the world, but has a military apparatus that dwarfs much of the rest of the world put together. This prompts us to get involved in everybody's business, so it's very difficult to ignore the United States in that sense. In cultural power, I can't imagine a country with greater cultural reach than the United States. We've created a sort of worldwide consumerism. All you have to do is think about McDonald's and blue jeans and Hollywood films and hip hop and on and on and on. From fashion to film, the United States is a powerful cultural actor. And of course, in political power, the United States, at least last time I looked, was still the head of NATO. There seems to be some rumblings about this after the recent election. But nevertheless, we have to figure out a way to talk about the United States in a world history context. One of the ways, or one of the factors that we have to deal with here is American exceptionalism. And let me characterize it for you. How do we treat American exceptionalism? Treat Americans as they think of themselves, as being distinctly different from everybody else? Or do we continually look for patterns whereby the Americans are part of a greater civilization? I suggest treating American exceptionalism as an analytical tool, or sort of a conceptual tool, that allows us to measure American achievements and actions. We have certain ideals that we think that we would like to live up to. We can look at our past performance and see if indeed we do live up to these notions of American exceptionalism. So let's find generalizations, large global patterns that we can use to fit the Americans into this story. And I'm going to give you some examples, some big issues here. First, chronology. When do we start to include the United States into world history? Do we go as far back as the Revolution? Do we wait until the United States sort of decisively intervenes in the 19th century? Or rather the early 20th century with the First World War and the Second World War? When do we begin to include it? We've discussed the slave trade in this course. And of course, North America was at the center, or was part of the Atlantic slave trade. So we have to work the United States in there with Atlantic slavery. We've discussed imperialism. And of course, North America was at the center of the Europeans' imperial projects, the Spanish, the English, the French, and others. We've discussed immigration. And certainly the United States is a recipient of millions of Asians and Europeans. So it's part of that bigger story. We've discussed the era of Atlantic revolutions. Remember the American Revolution, 1776, and then the French Revolution in 1789, and then the Haitian Revolution in the mid-1790s. So the Americans are part of that bigger story. We've discussed Latin American revolutions and the emerging civilization in Latin America. The United States was clearly an inspiration for many of these Latin American revolutions. And of course, the United States has been intimately involved in these Latin American countries since the 19th century. We've discussed industrialization. The United States emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries as the world's greatest industrial power. So you can't discuss these big issues without including the United States in them. We've discussed nationalism. And of course, American exceptionalism is one manifestation of nationalism in the United States. We've discussed the core and the periphery. And obviously the U.S. in its early history was part of the periphery. Think of the American South with its slavery and commodity crops like cotton, part of the periphery. But obviously today the United States lies at the center of the core of the great industrial powers. So we have to include it in these discussions. When we talk about diplomatic history, you have to include the United States. You go all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine, which is an attempt to keep the Europeans and Asian colonizers out of the Western Hemisphere. You have to talk about the open door with the United States policy towards China. Self-determination, which we will talk about at length in our next lecture. Of course, the United States decisively intervened in World War I and in the Second World War. And then, of course, after the war, during the long half-century of the Cold War, the United States created the World Bank and other financial institutions. The Marshall Plan to try to get Europe back on its feet. NATO military alliance led by the United States. And of course, more recently, we have seen the U.S. intervene repeatedly in the Middle East. So it's clearly ridiculous to try to avoid the United States when we discuss world history. I have colleagues who would differ. Another problem, what framework should we use when we discuss the U.S. history in a larger context of world history? Should we use a civilizational approach? Is the U.S. a separate and distinct civilization? Or is it merely one part of a larger Western civilization? Is the U.S. a settler colony or settler society? And by this I mean European colonizers move into an area, whether it's Canada or Australia or North America or New Zealand, and drive out the indigenous people and create a society based on these initial settlers. Another big question, does the United States have distinct characteristics that make it different from Europeans? There are a few. I'm going to mention a few of them for you. The United States never had an aristocracy, maybe with the exception of Southern planters, slave owners. The United States never really had a peasantry like you see in European history. A peasantry, an entire class of people locked into a hierarchy from which they cannot escape. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French nobleman who toured the United States in the 19th century, of course, wrote a very famous book called Democracy in America, and he talks about this very issue, those factors that make the United States different from Europe. And de Tocqueville pointed to the fact that the Americans never experienced feudalism the way the Europeans did. And of course, feudalism locks you into a hierarchy of classes, and there's not much mobility in this hierarchy. If you're a peasant, you are not going to become king or pope. Since we did not experience this, de Tocqueville says that we have a much more a sense of egalitarianism or equality among all of our citizens. The United States is a much more violent society than most West European societies. Americans tend to be obsessed with guns. The Second Amendment is argued about daily in this country, in courtrooms all across the land. The United States remains a rather religious society. Western European societies are increasingly secular, and the power of the church has diminished. The power of churches remain quite strong in this country, and even have political strength at times. The United States is traditionally much more hostile to socialism than West Europeans. De Tocqueville would probably say that this is due to our attachment to laissez-faire. Laissez-faire, the notion that the government has no role in your economic lives. The United States does not have a class identity. Due to immigrants from so many different countries, Asia, Africa, Europe. It's much more of a, what's the old cliche, the melting pot. Universal health care makes us a little different in the sense that there's still no consensus on how to handle health care in this country. We're fighting about it this morning, in fact. Many other modern industrialized countries have moved to a more comprehensive healthcare system. The United States is still battling with this. The United States really doesn't hold any advantage in technology anymore, except perhaps in the military realm or in space. These would be two areas where the United States does hold an advantage. Some similarities fitting the United States in with West Europeans. Well, we all experienced the Industrial Revolution. As we moved into the 20th and 21st centuries, the birth rates in the core have been reduced. Women's rights have come to the fore across Western civilization. The sexual revolution which took place in the late 20th century is common across the Atlantic. So let me end with a couple of things here. Does the United States exert a special mark on the rest of the world? Did the United States do anything unique as it became increasingly powerful? The U.S. displayed a combination of inexperience and naivete in foreign policy. We tend to make sort of grand universal proclamations. We talk about good and evil. We tend to like our villains to be easily spotted with a black hat and our heroes with a white hat. We don't care for complexity in foreign policy. The United States is certainly dedicated to consumerism, both domestically and worldwide. Again, Hollywood's cultural impact is worldwide. Films, fashion, CDs, DVDs, celebrity. The United States, of course, is at the core of the world system. So, is the United States distinctly different, or is it merely part of a larger Western pattern? This is a big question that we need to keep in mind as we go forward. Thank you.